Okay, hello everybody. We're going to talk about the 80s and public policy during this lecture here. We're going to focus on some things, and there's going to be things that I want you to kind of look at and investigate a little bit. Now, if we talk about the 80s, right, the Reagan era, the Reagan years, um, we had the economic policies of Ronald Reagan, which was what we kind of come to learn to be supply side economics, or that trickle down theory. Um, Inflation and unemployment were our biggest problems at that time. And Bush, Bush Senior, who was Reagan's vice president, originally ran against Reagan in the 1980 elections and considered um, supply side economics to be voodoo economics, and kind of just the way he classified it, where you reduce taxes, you promote unrestricted free market activity, and you decrease the welfare state. Um, Reagan also busted the air traffic controllers union. That's what we'll talk a little bit about that. And then Reagan also kind of focused on that really conservative ideology of reducing government spending, reducing federal income tax and capital gains tax, reducing regulation, and tightening the money supply to control that inflation. I always like to kind of make the illusion that Reagan and Clinton were considered to be Teflon presidents. And when we say Teflon presidents, usually, anytime there was a scandal or something happened that was negative, it seemed to not affect their popularity that much. Reagan had something called the Iran-Contra affair. And what was happening in the Iran-Contra affair was that the United States was dealing arms to Iran and then funneling the profits for those from those sales to a anti-communist group in Nicaragua at the time called the Contras, who are fighting the Sandinista government. Unfortunately, this was illegal. We had something called the Bowen Amendment, which Congress strictly prohibited the funding of the Contras during that time. The Democrats passed the Bowen Amendment, which restricted the activities of the CIA and the DoD in foreign conflicts. It was specifically aimed at Nicaragua, where, like we said, anti-communist Contras are battling the Sandinista communist government. During Reagan's presidency, with the cutting of taxes and the increased spending on national defense, caused us to go into a further deficit. We went from being the largest creditor nation in the world to the largest debtor in under 8 years. And this was because taxes were cut, but spending wasn't cut. And that's, a pretty simple thing to look at. Relations in the Middle East were already kind of strained. Iran and Iraq were in a bloody conflict. And at the same time, Iranian-backed terrorists were holding 7 American hostages in Lebanon. Reagan delivered an ultimatum to his advisors, and he wanted to get these hostages home. Reagan told his NSA person, Robert McFarland, I want you to do whatever you have to do to get this done. Robert McFarland argued that a deal with Iran would not only secure the release of the hostages, but also improve relations with Lebanon, and providing the country with an ally in that region where it desperately needed one. And also, on top of that, the U.S. would secure funds that the CIA would secretly direct to the Contra movement down in Nicaragua. The Lebanese newspaper Al Sharia first reported the arms deal between the U.S. and Iran. Reagan was already well into his second term, so this could potentially affect him at the ballot box. By that time, the Americans had 1,500 American missiles had been sold to Iran for $30 million. 3 of the 7 hostages were released, although the Iran-backed terrorist group that there later took 3 more hostages, so it was kind of really not effective. Attorney General Ed Meese launched an investigation into the deal and found out of that $30 million that was generated in profit, they couldn't account for $18 million of that. So $18 million went missing, which is kind of alarming when you look at that. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who is now currently a right-wing figure, president of the NRA, conservative radio talk show host, at that time was on the National Security Council. National Security Council is a group of military individuals that give the president some advice on how to deal with foreign relations. North said he made all of these deals with the Contras in Nicaragua under the direction of National Security Advisor Admiral John Poindexter, and he assumed that Reagan knew that this was going on. Oliver North was charged with 12 counts relating to conspiracy and making false statements to the government. He was convicted in his initial trial, but what eventually happened is his case was dismissed on a technicality. Admiral Poindexter was originally indicted on 7 felonies and ultimately tried on 5. He was found guilty on 4, sentenced to 2 years in prison, although his convictions were later overturned. So I think we're kind of seeing a pattern here. Reagan was never charged. In 1992, this should say George H.W. Bush. It's a typo. George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president, was elected president in 1988, and he pardoned Caspar Weinberger, who was a member of Reagan's administration involved in this. McFarland was charged with 4 counts of withholding information of Congress, which is a misdemeanor, 2 years probation, $20,000 fine. So, okay, in this section, we're going to talk about education, water policy, and public policy. Public policy is going to include taxation and regulation, and how we have certain things that are, set up to help the public in case they need some type of assistance. Okay, so we talk about federal spending. Federal spending remained basically steady, about the 20% of our gross domestic product from the early 60s up to the mid 2000s. Then we saw an increase. It was 28% of GDP in 2009. Now it's 30% in 2021. Now we also have entitlements, and entitlements are things like Social Security or maybe some public assistance packages. So those consist about 60% of federal spending, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And both sides, both Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, feel that we need to rein in entitlements and cap entitlements, but there is disagreement on what those caps should be. So make sure you're aware of that. Okay, if we look at some of the kind of public assistance programs that we have here, remember these are going to be funded by taxation and regulation, right? So a lot of these public assistance programs are known as means tested. So means testing means it's a test determined by a person or a household to see whether or not they're eligible to receive some sort of benefit or payment. The number of people in a house, the amount of assets you owe, the amount of money you have in the bank, the amount of money you make. And a lot of these programs include like state and federal welfare programs, including things like Medi-Cal, food stamps, and they measure it against a family's income against the federal poverty line, which is established. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Families is a program that provides state and territories with flexibility and operating programs designed to help low-income families with children to be able to achieve economic self-sufficiency and to be able to, in a sense, kind of meet what the cost of living is. States will use TANF to fund monthly cash assistance payments to low-income families with children, as well as other services. Medi-Cal is another public assistance program. This is California's Medicaid health care program, where it is health insurance that is provided by the state of California. Both federal tax dollars as well as state tax dollars are used to fund it. And this program pays for medical services for children and adults with limited income and resources. Usually, if you want to apply for this, you need to visit your local county building, and they can help you with the enrollment process. CalFresh or SNAP or EBT, this is a program for low-income families and individuals that meet certain guidelines. CalFresh benefits help supplement your food budget and allows families and individuals to buy nutritious food. And I always kind of point people toward this because I always hear like on the news and sometimes at school that there is a kind of a surplus of money for CalFest programs. So I always encourage people to apply. Worst thing they can do is tell you no. But I do hear there is money that at times is not used, which is allocated for this program. So entitlement spending, we have something like Social Security, which is born out of the New Deal. And if we look at our paycheck, we'll see these two kind of acronyms in our tax deduction boxes. Um, you know, FICA OAS and FICA Med, FICA Old Age and Security, and FICA Medicare. These are taxes that we pay. It's uh, it's a tax that we pay half and our employer pays half. Those, like I said, this was born out of the New Deal, and it provides you a source of income when you retire, usually at the age of 62, 65, 67, or 70, or if you can't work due to a disability, which is called SSI. If it can also support legal dependents with benefits in the event of a death, whether it's a parent or a spouse, and these are usually called survivor benefits. Medicare is government provided health insurance when you reach the age of 65, and this was born out of LBJ's Great Society. And if you look at your paycheck, you'll see that you pay into these taxes. And hopefully, we've been hearing kind of rumors that the right is trying to cut these programs. I'm not quite sure on how I would feel about that since, I've been paying into it since I started working when I was 17. So I would be very unhappy if I don't get anything returned from that. So here in the United States, we usually operate off of two general policies. We'll discuss it in a little bit, but remember, monetary policy is going to refer to central banking activities that are directed toward influencing the quantity of money and credit in an economy. So banks are in control, either lowering the interest rate or even raising the interest rate. We just recently seen an interest rate raise 0.75. So that is banks trying to affect the economy. Now, we also have fiscal policy, where it refers to the government making decisions about taxation and spending, maybe lowering taxes or increasing taxes and cutting spending, lowering taxes and increasing spending, or maybe lowering taxes and lowering spending. Both monetary and fiscal policies are used to regulate economic activity over a certain amount of time. They're both used to stimulate the economy. Simple as that. Monetary policy, banks control interest rates and the amount of money in circulation. Fiscal policy addresses taxation and government spending. Now, if you want to ask yourself which is better, really depends on your perspective and your ideology. Fiscal policy generally has a greater impact on consumers than monetary policy, as it can lead to increased employment and income. By increasing taxes, governments pull money out of the economy and slow business activity. Monetary policy can also work faster than fiscal policy. So again, it's really a matter of what your perspective is. And as we can see with this graph right here, and this is kind of a continual climb, we see since the 60s that federal spending has increased a lot. And it's not just due to the value of money going up. It's just, it's kind of shot up pretty quickly. Now, there is some questions about whether or not we should balance the budget, right? Balancing the budget would simply mean that you're taking in the amount of money that you're spending, right? Currently, we are $28 trillion in debt, right? So to kind of put a figure on that, if everybody in the United States had to contribute to pay off this debt, we would each need to contribute about $45,000, right? International investors hold about 20% of that national debt. China is one. Japan, they hold debt. They hold we owe money to them in some of our government sectors. And our kind of the healthiness or the prosperity of an economy is determined by their GDP. I had mentioned that phrase earlier, the gross domestic product. There's a complicated formula that is used to determine it, and this is a good way to measure how an economy is doing. Now, when we talk about tax politics, federal government finances itself through individual income tax, Social Security payroll taxes, and corporate taxes. Um, Social Security taxes are aggressive. There is a certain percentage that is paid. So within that percentage that is established by the government, we pay half, the employer pays half, right? So employers have to take that in mind when they're hiring workers if they can afford to take on that Social Security amount payment that they're going to need to do, right? Now, for up, you have your Social Security taken out of your paycheck up into when you hit 147,000 in a year. So once a person hits 147,000 in a year, they no longer have to pay into Social Security tax, right? And this isn't levied against non-wage income and investment income, so things like capital gains tax and stuff like that. So, um, there is fear that Social Security is not going to be sustainable for the foreseeable future. One of kind of the arguments or one of the solutions that people propose is to raise this 147,000 threshold up to 250,000. They feel that if you do that, you'll be able to fund Social Security for another 40 years. So that is something definitely that may be on um, in the future, but it is something that really needs to be addressed as well. Now, if we look at this pie chart, we could see where where income comes for the federal government and where they collect their revenue. So you can see 30% from payroll taxes, individual income, and then duties, excises, corporate income tax, and other. This is the budget for 2022. And as you can see in our federal budget, um, military is going to be the biggest portion of it with discretionary budget. Now, remember, and one thing that I really, really want to make clear is sometimes people believe that military is the biggest portion of our overall federal budget. It's not. It's Social Security. All right, so make sure you understand that. Federal income tax is progressive. Income is taxed at 7 separate brackets, and it's anywhere from 10 to 37%. Now, I'm not going to try to fool you and try to make it seem like I really know what I'm talking about with taxation when I probably know what the average layperson knows. Um, because the federal tax code is very, very hard to understand. Income tax, like I said, you could be anywhere from 10 to 37%. Um, Pluralists cite that a progressive income tax like this is evidence that the political influence of the middle and low income citizen. There's been people that have argued for a flat tax. I do not know enough to be able to give you a good guidance on this. The IRS is involved in taxing corporations. Currently, corporations are taxed at 28%, but they have a host of exceptions that can even get them down into single digits. Capital gains, which are profits or kind of money you make on an investment, these are usually taxed from 15 to 20%. So if you make a money on a stock, you can expect to pay about 15 to 20%. Trump revised tax policies in 2017. He reduced tax rates for businesses and individuals. He also increased the deduction amounts that people could take, family tax credits, eliminating personal exceptions. Again, this is some stuff that might not be totally familiar to you all. This is all tax speak, and it's really, really kind of sometimes difficult to understand. Usually, when you are filing your taxes, you can take deductions that will lower your tax liability. Like you can deduct student loan interest payments. You can prior, you used to be able to deduct most of your mortgage interest payments, but the Trump tax policies took that away. And if you have a child, you could take credit for paying of daycare and stuff like that. But that'll reduce your tax liability. And here's a little bit more about this. This benefited business and corporations and people with children because he doubled the tax credit. Okay, we'll talk about regulation next in this next section. It remains basically about 20% of our gross domestic product. It was 28% in 2009 and it was 21% in 2019. Out of that money, 60% of all federal spending are based off of entitlements, whether it's Social Security, Medicare, things that we pay into and that we're going to be entitled to when we qualify, right? And there's kind of been some arguments on whether or not or how we should cap entitlements, but it's more of an ideological view on how the welfare state and programs that are generated through entitlements are maybe pared down or cut out or even increased depending on your ideology, right? This is an example of federal spending. Now, currently in the United States, we have a $23 trillion deficit. That is an astounding figure, meaning the United States as a whole owes $23 trillion to different creditors throughout the world. International investors hold about 20% of the national debt. And when we talk about GDP is usually used to measure how well or how prosperous the country is. And there's a formula. We're not going to get too in-depth in that. That's going to be more of a political science 101 class thing that you'll talk about if you take that class, or maybe a macro or microeconomics class. So the way the government funds itself is it funds itself through individual income taxes, Social Security taxes. Remember, we have Social Security taxes that are deducted from our paycheck. We pay half, our employer pays half. So generally, it's about, I think it's roughly 8% of your income. You pay 4% and your employer pays 4%. So you need to kind of understand that. Corporate taxes, they only pay about 9%. And on Social Security taxes, they are aggressive. So each person is kind of on a flat number. And they're imposed on the first $132,900 of wage income. So once a person makes more than $133,000 in a year, they don't have to pay Social Security tax anymore. Here's a little bit of what federal spending was generated from and where the federal government collected the revenues. Individual income tax was about 50%, payroll tax was 36%, and then we can see the others like excise tax, corporate income tax. I don't think they have capital gains. They might have lumped capital gains under other. Capital gains are taxes that people make off of dividends of stock. So if I buy a stock, say I buy Apple stock and it's worth $10. I have one share. That means I have one share in the company and it's worth $10. Then the value of Apple goes up and now my stock is worth $20. So that $10 profit that I'm making, or that dividend that Apple might pay me out of that, is taxable. And it's taxable through something called capital gains. Here is where our budget was in 2018. As you can see, Social Security makes up the biggest part of the budget. Social Security and Medicare. A lot of people think defense is the biggest portion of the budget, but it's not. It's Social Security and Medicare. Something that I want you guys to understand. Now, I'm not going to try to act like I know what the federal income tax rate is and how that is all generated. It's a very complicated process, but income is taxed at 7 separate brackets or 7 separate rates, and you are a part of, or you fall into a certain bracket, which the government can tax you anywhere from 10 to 37% of your income. Corporations are taxed at 21%, but they have a bunch of exemptions that might cause your tax liability to go down. So that's why we see corporations don't give as much tax dollars as the American people. And we talked about capital gains, what those were, and they're only currently taxed at 15 to 20%. Now, another way that the government makes a lot of money is through, or generates revenue, is through regulation, right? Regulations are things that we have out there that are put into place to discourage some type of maybe illegal activity or pollution or worker exploitation or whatever. Um, so they generate the revenue. We have the activist regulators here. So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is a good example of one. So if you're ever discriminated against in a workplace, or in housing or whatever, you can make a complaint with the EEOC or even with the state, and they will investigate it. If they find out that you are violating some type of law or something, or regulation, they can definitely fine you. OSHA is the same thing. OSHA is the Occupation Safety and Health Administration. They dictate whether or not things are safe for people to work. We have regulations that we have to follow at work, and if there's an accident and OSHA is investigating it, there might be fines or things called corrective actions that may come out of it. So if somebody is working on a big project and they fall and they're killed or they're hurt, OSHA might come in and investigate what safety measures were ignored or what could have been put into place to help avoid those type of situations. But one of the more famous regulators are the Environmental Protection Agency. So we know pollution, clean air, clean water are all regulated, and if companies violate these regulations, they can be fined. In fact, remember the BP spill, the British Petroleum spill that happened a few years ago. British Petroleum was eventually fined $50 million for the spill that happened. So that's a good example of regulations. Now, some people argue that regulations hamper businesses. So when we have a regulation, you guys kind of understand that regulation is actually paid for by three different ways. So if we have and this is just an example, say we put the regulation or the law that everybody has to earn $15 an hour in minimum wage here in the United States. So what's going to happen? Who's going to pay the increase in costs? Businesses who have to maybe raise their prices, employees who might not get as many hours now because they have to maybe work into the budget ways to accommodate the $15 an hour jobs. Maybe there might be less jobs available out there. And ultimately the consumer. Just think about that. Anytime there is a regulation put into place, eventually we are the ones that are going to pay for it. So if we have a $15 hour minimum wage, and a small business has to implement that minimum wage, then in order to still maintain viability and to generate a profit, businesses might increase prices in order to accommodate that increase in cost to them. So ultimately, it's passed on to the consumer. This is estimated to be about $2 trillion worth of regulations in 2019. So the government has received about $2 trillion in revenue, which is about 11% of the GDP. So, do we need to deregulate a lot of these industries? Some of the complaints about excessive regulations are at increased cost to business and consumers, which we just talked about, hampers innovation and productivity. If places don't have extra money, they can't maybe innovate their business or reinvest into their business. Reduces competition, and doesn't weigh the cost of complying against the benefits of society. How can we fix the system? Should we privatize a lot of industries? Privatization is taking the duty of a government maybe service and passing it on to somebody in the private sector. So one good example of privatization here, and especially in San Diego, is trash and sewer. So the trash is collected, and it's actually collected by an independent company. And what they do is, then they take it to the city or the county dump. what the city and county has done is they've solicited bids for companies to do this service. Usually there's a belief that, they can do it more efficiently and less costly. And should we go toward that? Are there industries, and I want you to think about this, are there industries that you believe could possibly be privatized? Something that the government does that you might want to have the private sector do. Lastly, let's look at this. This is the Marine Court traffic data. So I'm actually going to open this. And we'll take a quick look. Oops. Okay, if you look at this, this is 2020 traffic fines. So this is another way the state of California generates revenue. If you look at this, go down and look at speeding. So if you look at this, speeding more than 26 miles an hour over a 65 mile per hour speed limit, we see the base fine is $100. But if you look at it with all the cost and regulation attached to it, your final cost is going to be $489 if you get a speeding ticket. You're going over 26 miles an hour. 1 to 15, it's a $237 fine. 16 to 25 is $366. So you could see, it could be cost effective. Cost prohibitive, and you see that the government generates a lot of money by this. Let's see if I can find disabled parking. That one, violation of disabled parking privileges, you could face a fine of about $1,100. So I don't know if that's using a placard illegally. It's not really defined, or is it parking in a stall? Look at the one right below it, parking in a space for an electric charging, $489. So all these fines that we see and that we get, it's actually money that goes back into the government to help run the government. So another source of revenue, and this is part of regulation. Okay, so that's going to be that for what we talk about right now. We'll go ahead and stop it here, and then if you have any questions, just let me know. Okay, thank you. We have to maybe deal with as far as property tax values. We've talked about Prop 13. We talked about Melrose. Melrose is an additional property tax for people that live in special designated areas that for 25 years you have to pay an additional eighth of a percent in property tax. That money is used to fund schools, police, fire, and so on. Now, there's also the question of vouchers. Should we give vouchers to people? Use this tax dollar money and give it to people who want to stick their kids in private school. That's a whole other kind of public policy issue that we're not really going to get into, but it's something that's out there. As far as education, we have about 6.3 million students here in California. 53% are Hispanic, and 1.4 million are English learners. So obviously, we have kind of a what's the best way to put it? Maybe a bit of an issue with test scores not being as up to par as some other states. This might be due to a lot of people here are learning English as a second language, and when you have English language learners and you have parents that are home that aren't English speakers, it might be difficult for them to help with homework and so on. We're below national average in spending and above in poverty. And we have the lowest percent in the U.S. of English spoken at home. So one interesting statistic is before all this pandemic happened, and I'm not quite sure what's going to happen, with the dwindling tax revenues and a lot of people not being being out of work. California schools spend about $10,300 a year on K through 12 students. That's about $2,000 less than what the national average is. And in comparison, now, this might not be a really good comparison or a really sound comparison, but if we look at prisoners, the state of California spends about $75,000 a year on to house a prisoner, right? So, obviously, prison guards have 24/7 jobs. This includes medical care, recreation, education as well. So I can understand why the figures might, and this is again 365 days a year, while the school year is 180 days a year. So it's an interesting stat to look at, even though it might be a little bit fallacious, and maybe trying to practice on a little bit of that, the fallacy that in this comparison. But I always think it's a good figure to look at. Now, when we talk about spending and some of the money that schools use, as you can see, if we look at the orange bar on the left, coupled with the kind of the light green and the dark blue, I don't know what color that is, the benefits color. So if you look at the spending, 2% of that is on teacher salaries and benefits and administrator salaries and staff and all that stuff. So we can see where most of our district spending goes to. And books and supplies, with anything, I mean, you guys have come to the realization that once you get a book or once you get a textbook, it's already outdated once it's printed, right? So I bet if we went and look at local high schools and tried to look at some of their texts, they're probably running on some very old textbooks. So the state budget included in 2018 to 2019 included $132 billion in general fund resources for K through 12. And overall spending for California public schools is about $193 billion. The funding sources for these are, the state tax, property tax, and other local sources, in the federal government. So state tax, money that we get taken out of our paycheck. Property taxes, remember that whole Prop 13, 1% of your assessed value. And the federal government also contributes money. So when we talk about higher education, which a lot of you guys might be interested in, obviously, is the 2020 budget for the California State University system right now is about $7.8 billion. The UC system is $9.7 billion, and California Community Colleges is $10 billion. Now, another really contentious issue here especially in California is water, right? So we first started to see water projects back in 1919 when Lieutenant Robert Marshall of the U.S. Geological Service wanted to transport water from Sacramento River to the San Joaquin Valley and then move it through the Tehachapi Mountains into Southern California, right? We had the Central Valley Act, which was a bond pass that was approved by voters that, started to fund these aqueduct projects. So our water supply comes from two sources, right? Surface water and water that travels water that is pumped from the ground. So, rainfalls, that is a water supply for us. And groundwater, where people dig a well and well out water, that's another ground supply. And then we also have a small amount of water that is used and taken from the ocean where it's desalinated and it's been purified for water. And there's some examples of water boards. Now, one question about water here in the United States and specifically in California is who owns it? I'm going to post a documentary that's on Netflix. I'm going to try to find it on YouTube as well. So you guys, for those of you that don't have Netflix, don't have to buy a subscription. It's not anything I'm going to have on the exam or anything, but it talks about water rights. And usually water rights in California is a very contentious issue. And the water is, the question is, who owns it? Should it be a public ownership or should private industries be able to own water?
You need water to survive. That is like the most imperative source of life.
We have residents in California who are living in third world conditions.
What's it like having to ration out the water for your kids?
It's really hard.
Water's the new oil. They were pumping water 24 hours a day, and now they're going out to the nearest town to go grab more water.
It's gonna go down in my lifetime.
What is?
Like water wars, you know, big water wars.
The Owens Valley, 3 hours north of Los Angeles. It's an ancient place where precious history is being disturbed.
The vegetation all died and the sand started blowing away, so what's left here is a big depression.
Kathy Bancroft is Native American, a descendant of the Paiute and Shoshone tribes. For generations, her ancestors have been buried right here. It's a secret and sacred place.
Do you know how old the burials are?
We've got some that are thousands of years old, and then we've got some that are, within a generation or so of us.
But decades of water mismanagement and severe drought have caused the unthinkable, uncovering the dead.
Whole burials are becoming uncovered.
So these would have been 6 feet underground at one stage.
Yeah.
And you've lost all of that because it's turned to dust and blown away.
Yep.
And with that comes the worst kind of souvenir collectors, grave robbers, stealing a people's history.
Imagine your grandmother being buried and somebody coming and digging up her burial. But you've also got the artifacts. We believe that those artifacts still belong to that person that left it sitting there. And so that's something that we've never bothered. But you have people that come, oh, I found this, and they think they need to take it for some reason. Our stories, our creation stories, are built on these mountains and places around here. And that's what I always beg and plead. It's like, how do I teach those stories and our history and our culture to my grandkids if you've destroyed them all?
This whole area was once a huge lake, complete with crisscrossing steamboats, and it's here that California's water wars began. 100 years ago, in a massive engineering feat, the valley's underground river was diverted to the thirsty new city of Los Angeles via a 300-kilometer aqueduct. Owens Valley made LA rich, and the lake turned to grey dust, drawing battle lines between the haves and the have-nots.
When it comes to water, a lot of people call us a colony of LA because the city of LA owns a big portion of the land here in the Owens Valley. And it's really interesting because they own it, but we have nothing to say about it. And they just do whatever they like with our water and the land.
Owens Dry Lake became the biggest source of dust pollution in the entire United States. And now Los Angeles has to pay to control the dust. So far, they've spent more than $1.5 billion on things like water sprinklers.
And has it made a difference?
Yeah, it's made a big difference. This valley was pretty bad sometimes, and you couldn't see anything because the dust was so bad. And we kind of all grew up with that, and we've got a lot of breathing problems and stuff. They've been working on it, and we have seen a really drop in the dust problem.
Over 80 billion litres of water a year used to control dust. On the other side of the Sierra Nevada mountains, the historic 5-year drought brought third world conditions to the farming community of East Porterville. Here, they rely on wells, and even though California had a deluge of rain earlier this year, backyard wells remain mostly dry. So locals have come up with a range of clever tactics to combat the water crisis. For Angelica and for her family, water is so precious they won't waste a drop.
Tell us about your dishwashing routine here then.
Okay, this little thing. This is to cover my sink. And when I'm washing my dishes, you know, it's gonna get a little bit of full. When it gets full, I recycle my water. Then I do my floor, and then after I'm mopping my floor, I give it out to my plants. So I'm doing 3 recyclings right there.
What do the plants think of the dishwasher?
Oh, they are happy.
Angelica and her family have been surviving without a well for over 4 years.
Tell me about when it went dry. Would you remember the day your well went dry?
Yeah, I remember the day it went dry. It was on one of those hot days, and we just woke up one morning, and there was completely like sand coming, you know, through the faucets, and really dark water, brownish water, muddy water.
The community lives off bottled water and tank deliveries from water trucks. Almost 100 years old, Vicky never thought it was possible for her hometown to run out of water.
I lived here 66 years, and I was born 1920, and I'm 96.
You were saying that this is the most difficult time you've had living here because of the water.
I have to say yes.
Could you describe what the garden used to look like? Take us around the different trees that you used to have.
Well, right here, I had 2 plums, one there, and then nectarines, and then 2 nectarines, and then apricot. 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Vicky's backyard orchard was her pride and joy for more than 60 years. Now it's gone.
No, I just go out there, and a lot of times I get to crying. I'm a crybaby. Well, you'd cry too if you'd have flowers like I did.
East Porterville sits in the middle of the biggest agriculture-producing county in the United States. Whilst the corporate-owned farms in the area have the funds to dig deep wells, local residents like Angelica are rationing bottled water.
My kids don't drink a whole bottle like this. So instead of giving this big bottle to them, you know, I give them a small one because I know they're going to drink this one.
So what's it like having to ration out the water for your kids?
They get mad at me, you know, they get frustrated, you know, because my daughter said, Mom, why can't we have a normal life, you know? Why it's this so complicated? It's really hard.
Everyday battles over a basic necessity.
Me and my husband, we kind of like talked about it so many times. And even my girls, you know, mentioning, well, why don't we just move, you know? We're to the city where there's plenty of water. But, I mean, it's easy to say, I mean, let's move. But when you realize that you're stuck here with the property, that in the future, it has no value. And it's just like, we can't drop everything, you know? Especially when this is your community, you got your neighbors that you know that you bombed for so many years, you know. It's just really hard. You're stuck. Honestly, you're stuck. Yeah.
This is a tight-knit community, and the drought has pulled them together in unexpected ways.
You know, some of the homes that they're out of water, so we're going to stop right here in this home.
Today, Angelica and her daughters deliver bottled water to neighbors who desperately need it.
Marcella! Yeah? Do you want water? I brought a couple of cases. Okay, let me. These people, you know, they can drive over there where is the water, you know, the donation. Because some of the people, as you see, they have broken cars. So what we do is, we try to bring water to them. Alrighty, girls. Let's just set it up. This is what I like. I mean, people are really like open and you know, they get like a little treat. ¿Cómo se dice? Un abrazo, un abrazo.
Thank you. You're welcome, hija. A ver cómo está ahí.
The church car park is converted into a makeshift bathroom, where families without water can do things we all take for granted, like showers and brush their teeth. The local county is gradually connecting homes to the main water supply, but no one knows exactly how long that'll take. In the meantime, Andrew Lockman from Tulare County oversees the tanker truck operation.
These are the large trucks, anywhere up to 6,800 gallons or so. And these guys, their job is to go to the water sources that are far away. These guys are doing all the running back and forth to the hydrants, to the sources. And the smaller trucks can just zip in here, fill up, and keep going.
For now, the truck drivers are the lifeline of this town. And I'm keen to talk to them. But for some reason, no one wants to talk back.
It's just a controversial place to be to try and get anything done. For example, even the truck drivers, who are in some ways the saviours of these places by bringing them water and pumping them into these green storage tanks every day, they've been vilified, they've been abused, and they're so shy now that they won't even talk to us.
I'm discovering a new battle line in California's water wars. The truckies are heroes to some, but villains to others.
Would you mind terribly if I got a shot of just you putting the water from the tank into the other tank?
Completely out of it. I prefer not to be in it at all. Thank you very much, man. It's a big blessing. Thank you so much.
I never thought it'd be this hard to get a truckie on camera. But they've been copping abuse in neighbouring towns where they collect water for East Porterville. That's the thing about water wars. They're complicated, and people get very protective. Just ask Robert Galvin, who co-owns a mini-mart near one of the reservoirs that used to supply East Porterville.
And they were pumping water constantly, non-stop, 24 hours a day, taking water out of the damn neighborhood back here. And then we finally got tired of it because it was causing all kinds of ruckus back there. And it just made me angry. It made the whole community angry. And we all had right to fight for our water.
What did you say to the truck drivers?
Well, I can't say it on TV, but I mean, they cussed them out. And they even had roadblocks where they parked their trucks in front of the tankers and stuff where they couldn't either back up or back forward. And so finally we said, that's enough. We need to take a legal stand and do a petition. And now they're going out to the nearest town to go grab more water, but now they're no longer grabbing it from us. Where's Angie, at home?
Robert's lucky. He has water. but his business hasn't escaped the water crisis.
It's come to the point that it's gotten so progressively worse here in Central Valley. So we're at the point that we're going to end up selling this at the end of the year, and we're going to move somewhere else. We haven't decided where.
Water is becoming more precious than gold. By 2025, it's estimated 2/3 of the world's population will face water scarcity, with water predicted to trigger global conflicts. So, you'd think rain would solve everyone's problems.
Other roadways also washed away by more than 8 inches of rain in some places.
Winding rivers on the way to lakes and reservoirs. Enough this month to end Northern California's 5-year drought.
The end of the drought in California made headlines around the world. When I first came here, Owens Valley looked like this. And now, a few months after the winter rains, the place is completely different.
We just had a great winter. A lot of people are calling it an extreme weather, you know. To me, it's how the winters used to be. There's all kinds of little dry lake beds throughout the valley floor, and they're all full now, and the creeks are running like they're supposed to be.
However, the snowmelt hasn't solved the water issues in this valley. The water war continues.
This is great to see, but this runs right into the aqueduct down here.
It goes to LA.
It goes to LA. But we have a big water problem to begin with. So they could be doing all kinds of stuff to make it better, to fill up the aquifers, keep it in the valley where it belongs, but they're taking it out. They're still taking just even more water out of the valley. I keep saying fill up the lake. Of course, they don't want to. And so we'd like to see it stay here.
In a strange irony, this area is now in a state of emergency because of the excess water. Authorities fear a deluge into the lake will wipe out the water sprinklers that control the dust. The sprinklers that cost $1.5 billion.
So they put all this time and money and effort into settling the dust. Now they got water coming that could settle the dust. It's that simple, but they're doing everything they can to stop it from coming on the lake, to destroy the infrastructure that they have to settle the dust.
Hugh definitely isn't convinced that the snowmelt will bring calm to California's water wars. He's preparing for what he calls Watergeddon.
Bit more protection, you reckon?
That's it. Yeah, you pack it in, try to get a watertight seal. When it rains, the water runs off the highway, comes around the bend here, and then it all ends up in my front yard. And you can see on the house how it's tilted. And the poor house has been through hell this last year. The house is no gem. It's been here since 1918. And,
but it's home.
It's home, yeah. And it's going to be paid for next year. And I was hoping then I'd have a few bucks every month to spend on it and try and fix it up a bit.
Hugh was embroiled in a complicated legal battle over alleged contaminated water, which was settled out of court. He also believes the street is sinking because of the pressure being put on groundwater supplies.
The system is just being overused.
There's a lot of pressure on this resource for sure, huh?
Yeah. Water's the new oil.
Have you thought about what you would do if you did have to move, if the house fell over or flooded?
Yeah, this isn't all about leaving, it's about staying.
California is in a cycle of ever more serious droughts, broken by more intense storms. No one knows what's next. Just north of Hugh's house is the tourist town of Lone Pine. a popular gateway to adventure in the Sierra Mountains. In this local outdoor shop, we stumbled across yet another person who believes the water war is coming.
You need water to survive. I mean, that is like the most imperative source of life. And it's going to be a tough one. I'm 34 years old. It's going to be, it's going to go down in my lifetime for sure.
What is?
Like water wars, big water wars.
Some say California doesn't have a water problem. It has a water management problem. But if the world's 6th largest economy can't manage water, what chance do the rest of us have?
For those people that have water up there, lots of water, conserve your water, because you never know what's going to happen. Love your water, because it's just like an oxygen. If you don't have an oxygen, you can't breathe. You can't breathe, you'll die.